Hi there. Thanks for joining me on Rethink Real Estate for Good. I'm Eve Picker, and I'm on a mission to make real estate work for everyone. I love real estate. Real estate makes places good or bad, rich or poor, beautiful or not. In this show, I'm interviewing the disruptors, those creative thinkers and doers that are shrugging off the status quo in order to build better for everyone. Rich Rogers is an urban planner and attorney in Buffalo, New York. In his practice, he focuses on tax credit financing and on creative problem solving to help public and private sector projects work from concept into financing and implementation. Rich is also a real estate developer with a project in lease-up on Buffalo's Main Street. There he's put his knowledge to good use, converting a 30,000 square foot historic building into modern retail and affordable housing units, and employing every trick in his book to build his super complicated capital stack, which of course includes tax credits. If that's not enough, Rich has a crowdfunding platform called Common Owner, focused on real estate and, you guessed it, crowdfunding tax credits as well. There's a lot to learn here. You'll enjoy listening in. Hi, Rich. I've been looking forward to this conversation.
Likewise.
So, what led you to study both law and urban planning?
I think there were a couple things that influenced that decision. When I was in undergrad, I was in the SUNY Model European Union program, traveled to Exeter and Limerick in Ireland, and just kind of saw some really great urbanism right up against some really beautiful countryside, and wanted to learn about that and ways to replicate that, here in the States, hopefully. And then also when I was out hiking the Appalachian Trail, I got really into conservation easements and, similar kind of legal concepts where I really wanted to study both things.
Interesting. So what is your specialty in law today?
In real estate development and commercial finance, typically representing developers, but largely focused on tax credit syndication and the monetization of tax credits. So that includes historic tax credits, new markets tax credits, low-income housing tax credits, and kind of other subsidies to help close construction financing.
So that kind of really puts you in the I don't want to say distressed, but I suppose distressed neighborhood realm, doesn't it, more often than not, with those types of credits?
In many cases, I think, particularly in upstate New York, there's a lot of communities that have, eligible buildings to undertake historic rehabilitation projects. So we kind of see it all over the map. And particularly more recently, with higher interest rates and high construction costs, probably folks looking at using those types of credits who wouldn't do so maybe a few years ago, as capital kind of gets tighter.
Interesting. Okay. So I know you have a lot of other things cooking. You're a very busy person. Tell us about your real estate development projects. I think you have done a few of
Sure.
your own, including renovating your own house, right?
Yeah, that's right. Right now, so we're undertaking the rehabilitation of the Monroe Building, we've called it. It's the former Record Theater in Buffalo, New York. Roughly $7 million project, roughly 30,000 square feet. We have 17 apartments that will be affordable to folks making 80% of area median income. And we have 6 commercial spaces that kind of range from 750 square feet to 5,500 square feet. We have kind of an exciting mix of tenants in there, including a coffee shop. We have a hair salon, some restaurants, some other stuff. So it's been a very exciting process, albeit a bit scary closing on the building just before COVID hit.
Oh, yeah, that's really bad timing. So, and how far along are you with the project now?
So we are currently pre-leasing apartments for occupancy March 1st. The first 10 apartments should go online next month, with the other seven to follow, likely by April, mid-April. Some of the commercial spaces are just starting construction. We do have several signed leases. We have a couple more commercial spaces to lease and finish designing. But that lease up should occur over the next couple months with full occupancy by June, I would say.
Oh, that's really exciting. So, aside from COVID, what's been the most challenging thing about this project for you?
Yeah, it has certainly been a challenge. I think, COVID, kind of the outcomes there, right? Certainly a spike in construction costs have been very, very challenging to deal with. We have a really great general contractor on the job, BRD, and they kind of worked with us through various value engineering and different kind of iterations of the project, which is unfortunate. On one hand, you hate to value engineer out some really cool amenities and things like that. But at the same time, you need to get the job done, right? So construction costs were definitely a challenge. I would also say holding costs. I think folks don't think about that all of the time. The building had a sprinkler system that had to stay heated so the
Oh,
pipes don't
yeah.
burst in the winter. And so we had the gas on for a time, and we have recently, but also had to do propane the one year, which got very
Oh, wow.
expensive.
Yeah.
Yeah, so holding costs are tough, and then obviously interest rates were a big one. Ultimately, we're able to rate lock with our permanent lender, and that's what kind of finally got us over the hump into the construction loan closing. So there were a lot of challenges and factors to kind of tackle.
So, I've got to ask, how are you financing it? Are there any tax credits in there?
There are. So we have both state and federal historic tax credits, which are 40% of the qualified rehabilitation expenditures, which includes, most of your construction cost, certain design costs, architecture, et cetera. We're working with Chase Bank to monetize the credits, Chase Community Equity. They've made an investment in the project. They'll make additional investments once construction is complete, based on the number of credits that we deliver to them. So we have a master lease structure, it's called, with Chase Bank, not to get too technical. But so that ends up being roughly 20 to 30% of the capital stack at the end of the day.
Significant, yeah.
It it really is, but it's really a necessary gap filler in places like Buffalo, where the rents perhaps aren't as strong as some other areas. We also are using what's called the Small Building Participation Loan Program through New York State Homes and Community Renewal. That's a per unit subsidy for us to keep our rents at 80% of AMI on average. So I believe we got $50,000 per unit, very low interest subordinate loan that closed simultaneous with the construction financing. I guess what's nice about that program is when you're doing one of these rehab projects, you're kind of stuck with the building envelope you have, right? And so we have some units that are nicer than others, some that, for example, we have 2 units that don't have windows. So the
Oh,
fact
I've got a
that
building like that.
they've actually come out great. I really actually prefer some of those units to some of the other ones.
Yeah, we have spectacularly big skylights in our windowless units that are just amazing. Yeah.
Same thing. And so, that worked out well. But I guess my point is that the flexibility with this program where it's not that every unit has to be below a certain AMI, some can be up to 120% of AMI, so a couple $1,000s per month. And then you can have some others that are far below.
And
As long as they average to
AMI for
80%.
our listeners stands for
Area median income. So essentially, yeah, there's a rental rate based on how much money you take home per household, right?
how
That's
much
going to
you
be
can
renting the
afford to
unit.
pay. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So this is brain damage, this capital stack.
It's a lot. We have another program that's a permanent loan program through Empire State Development in New York, and that's a transit-oriented development loan program called the Better Buffalo Fund. It's funded from Buffalo Billion, and that provides low interest financing, coterminous with the permanent loan, so it's a 30-year term. But where our project is on Main Street in Buffalo, it's directly across from a college, and it's very close, maybe a 5-minute walk to two light rail rapid transit stations, which we only really have the one line that goes under Main Street in Buffalo, but I think this project really helps support that light rail system, and kind of both ways. I think that's a huge amenity for our project, and then is also on several bus lines. So it's definitely very transit oriented.
Fabulous. Okay. If that wasn't enough, you decided to co-found a real estate crowdfunding platform called Common Owner. What led you to do that? And that was also during COVID, right?
Yeah, I would say just before COVID, it's a bit of a process to start a funding portal. If you're not familiar, obviously you are, but for listeners who aren't, it takes quite a long time. So we started that process before COVID, and we're able to launch kind of during COVID. But essentially, with our legal work and also consulting work and my partner's consulting work, we found a lot of folks struggling to access capital, right? Under kind of traditional means, perhaps not having the network to raise the capital, or kind of other challenges around that. So, I think just the complexity around some of the rules raising capital, or folks not knowing those rules or realizing them. And so, by creating a crowdfunding platform, those folks would then be able to access a broader pool of potential investors to help get their projects done. Because in many cases, those projects were quite good. They had grant funding, they had tax credits, they looked a lot better on paper than many projects that we did see getting financed all of the time. They just didn't have the access to raise the developer equity, and so that's something that we wanted to address. In addition to, in some cases, monetizing tax credits can be very difficult if the project is smaller in nature. And so using crowdfunding and bringing in additional partners and investors, allows for some structures to spread out those tax credits a bit. And I think many people would argue kind of the way that Congress intended with some of these programs. So those were the primary motivations behind starting Common Owner.
So I'm sort of fascinated by the historic tax credit equity twist on your platform. How does it work? Like, what are the types of offerings that are listed, and how do tax credits weave into crowdfunding?
Yeah, sure. So typically in a real estate financing that includes tax credits, you have a tax credit investor that will come in and take 99% of the credits, and there's very specific IRS rules around the way to structure these types of financings. But typically a bank, an insurance company, a similar entity will come in and they'll take 99% of the credits, and they'll put in capital during construction.
And they'll be a limited
Uh,
partner, right? They're not taking control.
exactly.
They're just a
The
partner for the purpose of those credits, and then they give you a certain number of pennies on the dollar, right? For the credits,
exactly.
and they turn around and get value for that immediately, um, as a credit against their own taxes, right? That's why they're
Correct.
interested. Yeah,
Yep. And so, right, they have the type of income that these credits work really well to offset. Um, and, they know, right, how much income they're going to have. There's a lot of things that work well for a bank or an insurance company to invest in these types of projects. Banks also get CRA, Community Reinvestment Act
credit.
credits
Yeah.
for doing so. But the issue here is that in many cases these tax credit investors want to do the smallest number of largest projects possible to reduce their due diligence overhead, asset management overhead, and the types of projects that a lot of cities and villages and urban areas really need are not necessarily these massive, redevelopments of old factories or train stations, right? They're these kind of mixed use Main Street buildings. And that creates a challenge, right? Because these more traditional tax credit investors may not want to be bothered with those smaller deals. So
It follows the same pattern that all real estate investors follow. They don't want to be bothered with smaller deals, which are
absolutely.
so important for our cities, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think crowdfunding, I think, broadens the pool of potential investors, right? In general, but also if you have these tax credits, maybe you don't need to undertake this highly structured, very complicated, kind of financing where an investor comes in for 99%, especially in many states that have state historic tax credit programs like New York. Those credits in New York are refundable, meaning that if you don't have tax liability, the state will write you a check for the overpayment of tax.
Oh,
So
wow.
yeah, so it makes it a lot more user friendly for regular people to then benefit from some of these credits. But your typical, real estate developer, sponsor, managing member kind of person is going to have a lot of losses, right, from depreciation and won't necessarily be able to use these credits. So by bringing in a lot of different investors, you can slice the credits more thinly where they can hopefully more effectively be used. And I think, one thing with crowdfunding is folks think about it as um, kind of individual, non-accredited investors. That's kind of who it's for. And I think that that's a challenge in the industry right now because I think if you look at SEC data, that's in many cases you still have mostly accredited investors investing in many of these offerings. And I think really when you're talking about these tax credits, ideally you have a mix of maybe real estate professionals, some individuals, but then also, starting to have, corporations, maybe banks, some other types of investors investing alongside these other folks to kind of, raise more capital for some of these projects.
So instead of a 99% like financial institution tax credit investor, you could replace that with a crowd of people who all get their little pro rata share of however much they
Mhm.
invest towards a tax credit, which they may be able to
Yeah.
use. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
So, right. You could, I mean, there's all sorts of ways to structure it, right? You could follow that more traditional model of the 99%. And then typically what happens in that type of a structure is after the 5-year recapture period for the tax credits, the interest flip, right? So the investor will take all of the or 99% of the credits for the first 5 years, and then the investor flips down to some lower amount, maybe 5 or 10% of the interests. and in some cases will exit the transaction, right? So here you might think of if you're raising equity anyway, perhaps you're going to syndicate 30% of the interest in the deal to investors. Maybe instead you sell 50 or 60%. Those folks, along with the cash flow they would get, may also get some tax credits.
Right.
And that can sometimes be a better, or
You could
a
also
way.
say you could also say that you, the developer, keep some of the credits for yourself. So maybe, you keep
Exactly.
40% flow to you and the other 60%. So there's lots of ways to skin the cat, basically.
Absolutely. Absolutely. But it can be a bit more straightforward, I think, than some of these really complicated structures, with hundreds of documents and hundreds of pages of projections and, everything like that. Looking more like a more traditional partnership.
Interesting. Okay. So how many historic tax credit deals have you had on your site, and have they been successful?
We only have a handful that I would say are really, raising equity for the tax credits. And there's a couple ongoing right now that you could check out if you go to the site. We haven't had one fully close. That's that type of offering. In terms of a regulation crowdfunding offering. We have had several deals closed that,
So just plain old crowdfunding.
yeah, which might have a right, plain old crowdfunding, but also some Reg D deals on the platform that have closed that have a tax credit investor, right? A separate tax credit
Right.
investor, this more traditional method,
Right. Right.
where the capital that's being raised is more for that developer equity piece.
Interesting. Okay. So what do you think are the most significant challenges facing less experienced real estate developers?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think, in my mind, maybe several years ago, it was mostly this equity piece. And obviously that's a really significant challenge and problem. But I actually think a really big challenge is guarantees, right? And liquidity and net worth and balance sheet. For folks, especially who are starting out, who might, not have a really strong balance sheet. Maybe they have a lot of student loan debt or mortgage debt or, something else, right? Being able to close one of these loans is challenging, right? You're going to need a partner not only to invest capital, but to also sign a guarantee and kind of be recourse on some of the financing. And that can be very, very challenging, especially, for someone starting out to, not only identify that type of partner, but negotiate a deal that still makes it worthwhile to do all of this work and be the general partner in the deal, right?
Yes.
Especially with some of these deals and some of these I guess tertiary markets, you could say. They're already very thin from a cash flow perspective.
Hmm.
And so by the time you bring in a partner and dice it up, for the guarantee, and then you also raise your equity, you need to really make sure there's something left for you at the end of the day. And I think that can be a very significant challenge, especially once you get into these deals and perhaps you own the building and now you're pot committed and it can be enormously stressful. But yeah, I think that guarantee
And
piece
also
is
in sort
tough.
of distressed markets or softer markets where the returns aren't as
Mhm.
high, but construction costs are probably the same or close to the same.
Yeah,
This is why all those little bits of funky funding that you talked about become so
yeah,
important because there's got to be something left for investors, right?
exactly. Right. I think these subsidies are very important to essentially create a market where one doesn't necessarily exist, right?
Hmm.
in a lot of these geographies. So, um, but it doesn't always quite get there, right? Especially in this type of interest rate environment that we've seen. So,
Yeah.
it's challenging.
So how do you think increasing interest rates are affecting developers in Rust Belt cities like Buffalo and Pittsburgh and
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's been a tough situation, right? Because I think a lot of people didn't see it coming, obviously, and it's made it harder to get deals done. I think I mentioned we're fortunate enough to rate lock on our deal at a good time with our permanent lender, and that ultimately allowed us to get it closed. But I've seen folks who didn't rate lock who never ended up closing their deal, right? As rates really climbed up. So that's a challenge on the front end, but then also um if you did a deal 5 years ago or 10 years ago and that interest rate resets right at the end of that loan term, you can get in a really bad situation, right? Because
that's one that I'm actually in.
yeah,
I'm smiling because I really want to cry. We have a
yeah,
we have a building which actually reset in mid-January, and fortunately, the upper interest rate was capped, or
mm,
we would have been paying an additional 1%. So,
mhm.
and fortunately, also at this point, there are no prepayment penalties. So if the rates go down, we can go shopping. But still, it's another $2,000 a month that we have to pay on a building that's limped its way through COVID, and we've had to discount rents. And I that virus
Yeah,
brought us to our
it's
knees. It's really tough. Yeah.
yeah, it's really a bad situation, I think, for a lot of folks, especially in some of these deals where they don't necessarily cash flow well. And at least in New York State, typically we'll see these tax abatement programs for real property taxes that burn off in many cases simultaneous with these rate resets, right? So
I
now,
know. It's
the
really hard. It's really hard.
yeah.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
it's yeah, it's challenging, but I think the interest rates have really brought many deals to a halt. I guess as I mentioned earlier, the interesting counterpoint is projects that might not have been looking for tax credits or other subsidies historically, now might need them to make the numbers work in some of these other markets that perhaps a bit more stronger rents and things like that. As rates go up, those folks start to kind of seek these types of subsidies and alternative financing methods.
So tell me then how tax credits, not just historic tax credits, but maybe new market, I don't know what else is out there,
Mhm.
how tax credits can move the needle for closing construction financing.
Yeah, so in many cases, you can, reduce that. So here in New York State, we have a brownfield tax credit program, um, which is again a refundable tax credit. It's based on, cleaning up a historically, contaminated site, and essentially get a percentage of the overall construction cost that's capped at either 3 or 6 times the site cleanup costs, right? So, and there's all sorts of adjustments. But at the end of the day, that refund can sometimes be a source for the construction lender to pay down their construction loan, right? So when that refund comes in on the brownfield tax credit, you could make a pay down to convert your financing, or there's some bridge loan products that folks are able to tap into. Some of the other subsidy programs, new markets tax credits is a very complicated program, but it does generate a nice subsidy if you can kind of get through the brain damage. Again, essentially you're really reducing debt, right, and reducing leverage on the project, bringing in equity that doesn't necessarily expect a traditional return, let's say, on capital, which allows you to fill these gaps in your capital stack and get through construction financing, right? Because you need less debt on the project if you're able to kind of raise capital by using these tax credits.
And then there's also opportunity zones, which are also another incentive for some investors. Yeah, so tax credits can be really huge, I think, but perhaps not, as you said, for smaller non-accredited investors. So it's a slightly different market, right?
Yeah, it depends. I think to really use the federal tax credits in particular, you have to have the right, tax profile. Anyone who's thinking about planning on trying to use tax credits should really have a long chat with their tax professionals just to make sure that they can use the credits. There's all sorts of rules around that, and which again is creating this more limited market for tax credit, monetization, right? So, but it varies, right? There's things like the real estate professional election. If you're a real estate professional, you may be able to use credits in a way that other folks can't. So it largely just depends on your tax profile, but
Mm-hmm.
that varies so dramatically from person to person, right?
Right, right,
So
right.
definitely talk to your accountant.
Yes. So, back to crowdfunding. What do you think are the biggest challenges for developers who try to crowdfund capital?
Yeah, I think there's a few, right? I think you know, especially for folks who haven't raised capital before, I think it's just a lot harder than people think, right? At the end of the day, it's really kind of sales, right? You're selling your project in terms of pitching it to investors, and that's challenging, especially if you don't really have the personality where you love sales. That can be really hard. I think understanding the rules and complexities around crowdfunding and kind of the advertising regulations and prohibitions and stuff, it can be a challenge, right? I think especially for folks who um, you know, the rest of the capital stack in many ways is more straightforward, right? Even if you're going out and getting grant funding, right? And certainly applying for a construction loan, none of that is all that complicated. Tax credits may be more complicated, but then you get into this capital raising piece that is really very hard work.
It's very hard work. I agree with you.
Yeah, and so I think a lot of folks really
Whether
just
you
kind of
crowdfund
underestimate
or
it.
yeah, whether you crowdfund or
Right.
not, it's hard work. It's just different work, right?
Right. And so kind of understanding those nuances and challenges. And then I think again, uh, being realistic in your anticipations of how much an investor is going to invest, right? I think what I've seen a lot of is folks, kind of have their list and they think that's going to be sufficient. And then investors will come in and maybe they're investing half or a third of what they anticipated, and that can leave you in a really tough spot, right? I think there's definitely this build it and they will come kind of mentality for some folks, and that's just not the case, right? There's not just people out there waiting to invest in your project in general, right? You need to really build and cultivate those relationships. So it's hard,
I
and
see it as
especially in this environment.
I think it works best when you have developers who understand that it's just not a one-off thing. That crowdfunding offers
Mhm.
them an opportunity to gradually build a group of investors who will follow them from project to project, and that is not just one project; it's a series of projects. And I think those developers who get that really do best, and they sort of come up with a marketing strategy first with the first project, and they figure out what works for them and what doesn't, and it can be wildly different for different people depending on where your network lives. Does it live on social media, in the local coffee shop? Very, very different. I don't know. I think I wish people understood that instead of sort of believing it's just, as you said, you just build it and they will come, because it really doesn't work that way. It's really,
Yeah, I agree. I also think that, in some cases, I think folks who are, you know, really new or inexperienced or, developing real estate don't, realize that they're selling securities and that they're even, kind of
that was the other
subject to
question I had for you.
these
Yeah.
rules. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then they
And
have to follow the rules when they have these investors, and they need to
right.
do what they offered to do. They need to follow through. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly. And so I think that's a big challenge, telling people that they have to follow all these rules and folks can sometimes get pretty defensive about that if they're really confident that they're right. And so I think for that reason, it's still fairly new, right? And I think, I certainly thought that the equity crowdfunding space would take off faster than it has, but I think when you combine the fact that some people in real estate don't realize that they're selling securities when they're raising capital, and that you had this really long period with no changes to the securities laws, right? I think there's still a lot of absorption that's still kind of starting to
right.
happen. I do think, over the last 5 years, there has been a broader swath of the population that's hearing about crowdfunding and excited about it. But I think there's still, we're kind of scraping the tip of the iceberg, so to speak.
Yeah, I agree. Are there any warts to the regulation crowdfunding rule that really irritate you? I have some.
um, yeah, I mean, I think the audited financial requirements, and I think they have made some good changes over time in terms of a lot of the rules that have bothered me. But the just the cost of the financial
Financial
review or
statements,
audits,
yeah.
yeah,
So I think
that's a
what's most
challenge.
upsetting about those, our listeners, is that there's a financial review or an audit required if you want to raise more than $125,000, and that was, I suppose that this rule was really intended for small businesses that were already operational. So sharing financials makes sense. But in real estate, you typically have a brand new inception entity that has done nothing. And often it's formed right before the property is purchased. So now you're spending money on a financial review or an audit of a whole bunch of zeros. And you can't get out of it. It's a regulation, right? It's very silly. And even for a small business, that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah.
That's a
I,
very high bar, and I'm not sure that anyone looks at them.
Yeah,
There's
except
that
for
too,
us, right? I think
except for
most
us. Yeah,
investors, yeah, most investors. Well, it's a bit hard to say, but also there's a lot of rules and regulations around forward-looking statements and not being able to have these certain
projections,
types of projections,
projections.
essentially, which is ironic because as an attorney, you know closing these tax credit deals, the projections really drive the deal, right? You have this set of 70-page projections, and everyone spends hours and hours and hours poring over them, from the investor to the lender to the developer and all of their counsel, right?
But it doesn't mean that you can't present a cash flow picture and an operational
Sure,
budget. You just can't
sure,
project an internal rate of return. You
sure.
can show investors how much free cash there is. You can show people exactly what the project is going to
Yeah,
do, but you can't. And an experienced
yeah.
investor is looking for internal rate of return. They'll have to figure it out
Mhm.
themselves, right? That's
Right. And but I guess my point being is that on some of these other deals with these, granted, more institutional types of investors, that's a specific that rate of return is
It's
a
very
really
important.
material
Yeah.
thing that everyone
Yes.
is commenting on and adjusting the deal terms to accommodate, right? So
Right, right,
you
right.
definitely have a different kind of framework there. So that's a challenge. I think the advertising rules and the way that these offerings can be marketed, I think could just maybe be a bit more clear for some of the issuers and the folks
Yeah.
trying to
Yeah,
raise
yeah, yeah.
capital. I think they're a little confusing as well, and so then folks don't want to do something wrong, so they're very scared about it. So yeah.
But Rich, we still love this rule, right?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the way it opens up, access to investors is absolutely transformative and really important, right?
It is, it is.
Even in spite of all the challenges that we've been
Right.
discussing for much of the call, I think it's really important, and I do think, the thing that maybe gives me the most hope is that many of the changes that were subsequently made to the rule, I do think were really helpful in terms of,
I agree.
the accredited investors and the special purpose entities and all sorts of changes. So I think that there is, I'm cautiously optimistic about the
Yeah.
future of the rule
We hope it will go
and the
mainstream,
exemption.
right?
Yeah.
Okay, so just to finish up, what's next for you?
So I have one more real estate
This
develop.
is a loaded question too, right?
Yeah. I have one more real estate development project, and then I am done developing real estate. I will be retiring from that aspect of my life. But I'm actually looking forward to joining the small change team with some of my colleagues, and really excited about working with you, Eve, and your team moving forward.
And we're very excited too. We think together we'll be stronger, bigger, more mainstream, maybe.
Absolutely. Hopefully.
Well, thank you very much, Rich. And I actually can't wait to see your project in Buffalo. I've got to go up and take a look.
Yeah,
Sounds
it's really
fabulous.
exciting. Yeah,
Okay.
it's a beautiful building.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Eve.
I hope you enjoyed today's guest and our deep dive. You can find out more about this episode or others you might have missed on the show notes page at rethinkrealestateforgood.co. There's lots to listen to there. Please support this podcast and all of the great work my guests do by sharing it with others, posting about it on social media, or leaving a rating and a review. To catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on LinkedIn. Even better, if you're ready to dabble in some impact investing, head on over to smallchange.co, where I spend most of my time. A special thanks to David Allardyce for his excellent editing of this podcast and original music. And a big thanks to you for spending your time with me today. We'll talk again soon, but for now, this is Eve Picker signing off to go make some change.